The year is 1000 AD. Somewhere on the northeastern coast of North America, a longship runs its keel onto a gravel beach. The men aboard, Norse sailors from Iceland and Greenland, hardened by years of North Atlantic crossings, step ashore onto ground that no European has ever touched. They have been at sea for days. Before that, weeks of sailing west from Greenland along a coastline that kept revealing itself in fragments. First, a flat, rocky shore they named Helluland, stone slab land. Then a forested coast they named Markland, forest land. Then this, a place where wild grapes grow, where rivers run with salmon so thick you can almost walk across them, where the grass stays green later into autumn than anywhere in Greenland or Iceland. They call it Vinland, Wineland. The leader of this expedition, Leif Erikson, son of Eirik the Red who had founded the Greenland colonies, is not a man given to poetic exaggeration. He is a practical man making a practical assessment. This land is better than Greenland, better than Iceland, better in the ways that matter to people who spend their lives calculating survival than almost anywhere the Norse have settled. He builds houses, he winters there. He goes home in spring and tells everyone what he found, and what followed, the expeditions that came after Leif, the settlement attempts, the contact with the people already living on that coast, the years of presence and the eventual abandonment, is one of the most extraordinary and most under-examined stories in the history of human exploration. The Vikings found America, and what happened next should have changed the world. It didn't. The question of why not is the most important question in this entire story, and the answer is not what most people assume. Before we follow Leif Erikson to Vinland, you need to understand the world he was sailing from. Greenland in 1000 AD was not the desperate outpost it would become 300 years later. It was a functioning Norse colony, approximately 3,000 people. Two main settlement areas on the southwestern coast, where the climate permitted farming, dairy cattle, sheep, a trading economy based on the export of luxury goods, walrus ivory, polar bear pelts, and narwhal tusks, to the Norse markets of Europe. But Greenland had a problem. The same problem Iceland had had a generation earlier: timber. Greenland had even less timber than Iceland. The Norse were dependent on imported wood for construction and ship repair. And Markland, the forested coast to the west, was full of it. The best timber in the Norse world was growing untouched on the coast of what is now Labrador, Canada. 2 days sailing from Greenland. The economic logic of Vinland exploration was not primarily about the grapes. It was about the trees. Greenland needed timber. Markland had it. This is the context for understanding what happened. After Leif's voyage, his brother Thorvaldur made a second expedition and explored more extensively. He was killed in a skirmish with the indigenous people. Thorvaldur's death was the first warning. Then came the largest expedition. Thorfinnur Karlsefni, a wealthy trader who married Gudridr, organized what the sagas describe as a genuine colonization attempt. 60 men, 5 women, livestock. They stayed for 3 years, long enough to have children. The first European child born in North America was Snorri Thorfinnsson, son of Karlsefni and Gudridr, born around 1002 AD. And then they left. Not because Vinland was not what they had hoped, because of something they had not fully anticipated. The Skraelings. The sagas use this word for the indigenous people the Norse encountered in North America, almost certainly the Beothuk, or Algonquian peoples. The first contacts were cautious but peaceful. The Norse had goods the Skraelings wanted. The Skraelings had knowledge of the landscape and resources. Furs exchanged for red cloth, milk, which the indigenous people found remarkable. Small items traded with the particular wariness of two cultures encountering each other. And then something went wrong. The sagas give different versions of what triggered the violence. One version: a bull belonging to the Norse settlers ran into the forest and terrified the Skraelings, who interpreted it as aggression and responded accordingly. Another version: a Norse man killed a Skraeling caught stealing weapons. Another: a misunderstanding in trade negotiations. The specific trigger does not matter as much as what it revealed. The Skraelings were not a small, easily displaced population. They were numerous. The sagas describe the subsequent attacks, the Skrælings arriving in large numbers, in boats, with weapons, organized and purposeful. The Norse had expected to encounter manageable resistance. They encountered something different. A continent that was already occupied by people who were not going to allow a Norse settlement to establish itself on their coast without a fight. The Norse decided the fight was not worth having, not because they were cowardly, because the math did not work. 60 Norse settlers against a continental population whose full size they could not measure, and whose capacity for sustained resistance they had already experienced. The timber was valuable, the land was good, but the cost of holding it exceeded what the colony could sustain. Karlsefni made the decision. They were going home. The archaeology of Meadows confirmed what the sagas described. The site, discovered in 1960 by Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad on the northern tip of Newfoundland, contained the physical evidence of a Norse settlement dating to approximately 1000 AD. 8 structures: a forge, iron slag from smelting, a bronze cloak pin of Norse design, butternuts, a tree species whose range does not reach Newfoundland, meaning the Norse had traveled further south to obtain them. The site was not a permanent settlement. It was a base camp, a way station, somewhere between 3 and 160 people at any given time, based on the structural capacity of the buildings, used for ship repair, for processing timber from Markland, for short-term occupation during exploration and resource extraction voyages. Not a colony in the full sense, but a presence, a consistent, purposeful, organized presence on the North American coast. And here is what the archaeology suggests about the timeline of that presence. Meadows was occupied for a relatively short period. The archaeological evidence does not support continuous occupation across decades. But the sagas describe continued Norse contact with North America long after the main settlement attempts. Regular timber voyages to Markland. The Icelandic annals record a voyage to Markland in 1247 AD, 250 years after Leif Erikson. 250 years of Norse boats crossing to North America, loading timber, sailing back to Greenland. The quiet, undramatic, economically motivated kind of contact that does not make it into sagas but keeps a supply chain running. And then, in 2021, something extraordinary. A team of researchers, led by Pauline Dube and Michael D. at the University of Groningen, published a paper in the journal Nature. They had been working with a piece of wood recovered from the Meadows site, wood that showed the specific cut marks of iron tools. Norse iron tools, not indigenous stone tools. Wood that had been felled and worked by Norse craftspeople. They used a new dating technique. Radiocarbon dating synchronized to a known solar event, a massive spike in cosmic ray bombardment. Recorded in tree rings worldwide in 992 AD, that provided dating precision impossible with standard methods. The result: the wood was felled in 1021 AD, precisely, not approximately, precisely. The Norse were in North America in 1021 AD. This is the earliest precisely dated European presence in the Americas. On a specific date, in a specific year, Norse people were cutting trees on the coast of North America with iron tools, 500 years before Columbus to the year. Here is the question that the Vinland story forces on anyone who thinks about it carefully. Why didn't they stay? Not Karlsefni's expedition. The reasons for that withdrawal are documented and comprehensible. But afterward, 250 years of continued contact, regular timber voyages, demonstrated knowledge of how to reach North America, demonstrated capacity for North Atlantic crossing, a Greenland colony that was growing and needed resources. Why did no subsequent Norse expedition attempt a more serious colonization of North America? The standard answer is the Skrælings. Indigenous resistance made permanent settlement impossible. This is partially true, but only partially. The Norse colonized Iceland in the face of nothing. Iceland was uninhabited when they arrived. The Norse colonized Greenland in the face of a previous Dorset culture presence, that had largely vacated the settled areas. The Norse raided and eventually settled in Ireland, England, Scotland, Normandy, Russia, all of which had populations that resisted. Why was North American indigenous resistance uniquely deterrent? The answer may be scale. The Norse in Europe and the Atlantic islands were operating against populations comparable in size and technology to themselves. The advantages of Norse military capability and organizational sophistication were real and decisive. In North America, they were operating against the edge of a continental population. Millions of people across a landmass whose size they could not estimate. The resistance they experienced at Vinland was not the full force of North American indigenous military capability. It was the local response. And even that was enough to make the colony untenable. But here is the darker possibility that some historians have raised. The Norse did not fail to colonize North America only because of indigenous resistance. They failed because they were not ready. The agricultural and organizational systems that allowed European colonization in the 15th and 16th centuries did not exist in 1000 AD. The specific disease ecologies, the specific military technologies, the specific organizational models were not present. The Norse in Vinland were a pre-gunpowder, pre-epidemic culture, meeting a continental indigenous population. The same encounter in the 16th century produced catastrophic consequences for indigenous Americans. In 1000 AD, it produced a failed Norse settlement. Because the specific conditions that made European colonization devastating, the epidemic diseases, the firearms, the horses, were not present. The Norse were, in this sense, 500 years too early. Not too small, not too weak, too early. The world that would have made their presence in North America consequential, in the way that Columbus's arrival was, that world did not exist. The Norse found America, and the world was not ready for what that meant. So nothing happened. 500 years of nothing, and then Columbus, and everything changed. And the Norse footnote in the history of North American contact became exactly that, a footnote. In the small village of Meadows in Newfoundland, there is a reconstruction. Full-scale buildings built in the Viking Age style, on the site of the original Norse settlement, using archaeological evidence to guide every detail. Visitors walk through them. They stand in the spaces where Norse settlers stood 1,000 years ago. They look out from the same doorways at the same coastline, the same cold gray ocean, the same dark spruce forest, the same rocky shore. The guides tell the story of Leif Erikson and Karlsefni and the Skraelings and the withdrawal, and sometimes a visitor will stand in one of those longhouses and ask the question that the story always eventually produces. Why did they leave? Why did they come all this way, across the North Atlantic, past Iceland, past Greenland, and then go home? The guides give the historical answer: indigenous resistance, supply challenges, distance from support, the economic calculation that did not work out. All true. But there is another answer, an answer that is not historical but human. They left because they were people, not because they were Vikings, because they were people who had sailed to the edge of the world they knew and stepped off it, who had built houses and planted gardens and had children on a coast that no one from their world had ever seen before, and who had discovered that wanting something to be home is not the same as it being home. The distance was too great. So they sailed east, back to Greenland, back to the difficult, cold, marginally survivable world that was actually home. Gudrider Thorbjarnardottir, the woman who gave birth to Snorri in Vinland, did not stay in Greenland. She went further. She sailed to Norway, then walked to Rome. A pilgrimage of thousands of miles she made alone in her old age after her husband's death. A woman from the edge of the world, walking the roads of medieval Christendom to the center of the Christian world. What she carried with her, what she knew, what she had seen, we do not know. She did not write it down. She became a nun after returning from Rome. She died in Iceland, where she had been born, the farthest traveled woman of the medieval world, ending her days in the place she had started. The Norse found America, and they went home. But for 250 years they remembered. Men who kept sailing west for timber, who kept crossing to the coast that no one else knew about. Because the trees were good, and the crossing was possible, and the place was there waiting as it still is.